Hey everyone. Right now I want to do a lecture for you on Alexander the Great. We've gone through Greece and we've talked about pretty much everything that you could talk about with Greece. And Alexander, of course, is at the end of the Greek period. And it's important to talk about Alexander for our purposes in AP world because not necessarily his military exploits, or they're not going to ask you lots of details about his battles, but what we want to look at is his influence on the Mediterranean world and beyond, as well as his influence on Hellenism. Again, Hellenistic period, the period where Greek culture and art and learning goes out of Greece to other places. And one thing we're going to notice here, and we'll talk about this at the end again, is that Alexander conquers a lot of territory, but that's not necessarily why he spreads Hellenism. The places that he conquers, of course, are going to be more Greek simply because of his influence. But he's actually more influential in societies that learn from his example and look to him as a hero, look to him as kind of a demigod, and copy his exploits, right? And so the most Hellenistic of cultures is never going to be conquered by Alexander, but is going to learn from Alexander and his example. Okay? So, Alexander the Great. The first thing we need to know about Alexander the Great is he was not from Greece officially, right? As we've learned, the Greek map, we have two peninsulas here, and that is Greece proper, right? Now, Alexander is from a northern area known as Macedonia. And Macedonia is here. Now, if you were Athenian, or even if you were from Thebes or from Sparta, then you probably consider the Macedonians to be like you're from the rural areas, if you use the slang word, hillbillies, right? And so Alexander was from that area, and for the most of the Greek period, the Greeks considered that not to be Greece, but to be kind of the back of beyond, right? Macedonia is also subject to Persian conquest during the Persian Wars. A large Persian army comes across and conquers Macedonia and stays in Macedonia until they're chased out by the Greeks. That's also going to play into our story as well. So at the end of the Greek period, when Athens is defeated by Sparta and Athens begins to decline, Sparta, of course, stays the same. It will experience its own tragedies and natural disasters, earthquakes, things like that. And all Greek city-states will start to decline. As those Greek city-states decline, the kingdom of Macedonia begins to pick up speed. It begins to grow and begins to become more powerful. But one of the reasons why that is because of Alexander's father. And Alexander's father is Philip II of Macedonia, right? He was a very strong king, a powerful conqueror. He's going to be creative and inventive in military technology, which we'll talk about in a second. And he's able to expand his power through northern Greece and eventually invade into Greece itself and actually conquer Greece. So he's going to be the conqueror of Greece and the uniter of all the Greek city-states. Now, we talked about at the beginning how there was no Greek empire because there were too many mountains and the terrain was too difficult. And that's true for the majority of history. But the exception, of course, is Philip. Philip is able to come down from Macedonia and conquer all the Greek city-states and put them under his control. Now he was married to, this is Alexander's mother, his first wife is named Olympia, right? So Philip is, you consider a typical king of the period. He's very brash, he's very confident, he's somewhat of a jerk in many ways, and he marries Olympia. And this was a political marriage. She was from another area, but she was also not just a queen, but she was also a priestess. And she worshipped this cult of snakes, right? And so she had like symbols of snakes and stuff that she worshipped. And she also would have live snakes in her room and her sometimes, like different places. And sometimes she would sleep in the bed with the snakes and just really weird stuff. And so what we have here is we have Philip, who's this traditional kind of conquering, hard-nosed king. We have, as you saw maybe from his picture, he'd lost an eye in battle. So he's, rough and ready, war veteran. And you have Olympia, who's this strange kind of spiritualist. And when Alexander is born, they are both going to really fight for his affection. They both are going to strive to get Alexander to love them the best. And so you have this dysfunctional family that Alexander grows up in. And very soon after they are married, Olympia and Philip fall out of love with each other. They don't sleep in the same rooms. And they cordially, by the time Alexander is of age, they cordially hate each other. Right, and so this is going to be family strife throughout Alexander's childhood and even into his adulthood. All right, so here is the military technology that Philip changed to make it easier for him to conquer the city-states of Greece. And we are familiar with the phalanx, and Philip was familiar with the phalanx. But what Philip does is Philip changes the phalanx and alters it to the point where it becomes a dominant force over the traditional phalanx. Now, as we can see, we have done some significant things here. We have taken the spear, which traditionally was about 6-7 feet long, and we've extended it, making it into a pike, which is like 16 to 18 feet long, right? We have taken the shield and we've made the shield much smaller. Remember, in the traditional phalanx, the shield is as much of a weapon as the spear. You push with the shield, you bludgeon with the shield, you stab with the spear, right? Well, here, the shield is a very small thing. It doesn't cover the thigh to the shoulder anymore. It just covers this area. You don't really need it. With an 18-foot pike, which you have to hold, you're no longer holding a spear like this. You're grabbing the pike under your arm like this and hugging it to your side so they can. And so the shield, you can't have this big heavy shield, and so it's a much smaller, lighter shield. But your defensive weapon is no longer the shield; it's the pike, because the pike is so long that you're out of arm's reach. So nobody can reach over the pike and stab you. Now, notice that the first 3 or 4 rows of the Macedonian phalanx has the pikes going straight out, pointing at the enemy. Now, as you get about to the 5th row, they start to angle the pikes upward, and then more angle, till eventually the pikes are straight up and down. Now, this does a couple of things. First of all, it allows for, if the first 2 or 3 ranks are wiped out in a battle, it allows these ranks to easily just lower their pikes and they just keep going, right? Also, if you're facing archers, you don't have a shield that you're going to put up that's going to be able to cover much because it's too small. But with all of your phalanxes located here, the arrows would come through here and most likely glance off these phalanxes. And even if they do hit you, they'll hit you at an angle and it won't hurt. It won't be straight into you because they will have bounced off all of these pikes that are up and, will glance off, hopefully harmlessly, right? And so that's your defense. Your defense is the pikes above your head. So with this type of porcupine, I guess, phalanx, this is kind of a human tank, and they would just roll across the battlefield, not really stabbing or making any motion, but just driving into people until eventually they surrendered or fled the battlefield, right? And this is the way Philip conquered Greece. Okay, now, Alexander grew up in this household, right? And there are lots of interesting stories about Alexander as a child, and then later he grows up and becomes a general in his father's army. One thing that Alexander was good at and tried to implement was the idea of cavalry. Now, in Greece, as we learned, you didn't have cavalry because the terrain really didn't fit the horse. There wasn't a lot of large plains where horses could roam and graze. And so the majority of your Greek warfare in the ancient world was done on foot. But Alexander, living in northern Greece, where he had more plains and more open area, became very familiar with horseback riding and used that to his advantage. And so in battles in Greece where Alexander would assist his father, Alexander would be in command of the cavalry, and his father, of course, would command the phalanx. And so what you have here is you have kind of what historians have called the anvil and the hammer. The phalanx would be the anvil, which is the flat metal thing that you make the hammer, the tools, the metal tools out of, right? And the hammer would be the cavalry. So the anvil is here, and the enemy is on the anvil, the phalanx, and then Alexander would come through with his cavalry and just smash it, right? And so it was the perfect weapon of the immovable object and the irresistible force working together to crush the enemy, yeah? But not all is well in Alexander's family. Alexander insulted his father in some way. His father was so offended that he swore to marry another wife and have another child, and Alexander would not be king, but this new child would be king. Of course, he did this also to irritate Alexander's mother. And so while this is going on, Philip is attending a wedding, and Philip is stabbed at the wedding, right? One of his servants, who was also a lover, stabbed Philip at the wedding, and he was caught. And before he could be questioned, Alexander, who was at the wedding, took out a sword and stabbed him, right? Just on the spot, just killed him. And again, out of anger, out of you killed my father, that type of thing, maybe. But some historians believe that Alexander was actually in on this, that he actually paid the guy who already had a beef with Philip to kill Philip, and that he would take care of it and help him get away. Once the guy is caught, Alexander kills him to shut him up, and therefore Alexander is king. And that's just conjecture, but with this type of family dynamic, with Alexander being the guy who he was, I wouldn't put it past him. However, Alexander blames the Persians. The Persian Empire is still there. It had been defeated by the Greeks, but it went home and stayed and was still a very powerful, large empire. Philip, after conquering Greece, had always planned, or had in the back of his mind, he had always hoped to be able to gather a Greek army and invade Persia. But of course, he died before that ever could happen. Alexander, obviously, after Alexander becomes king, it becomes evident that that is his goal. He wants to invade Persia. Now, his reasoning is that they sent spies to kill his father. And so they were afraid of Macedonia. They were afraid of Philip. And so according to Alexander's version of the story, the Persians sent spies to the wedding, and those Persian spies killed his father. Now they have to pay, right? And so that's his reasoning for invading Persia. Okay? So he becomes king at age 20. All right, so Alexander goes to Greece. He collects 35,000 hoplite soldiers, and he crosses the Hellespont, which is that area that we looked at above Macedonia, into what is modern-day Turkey or Persia. And that's around 334 BC. Now, the Persian Empire is still the largest empire in the West. It has hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Even because they lost the Greek wars, but that didn't really hurt them at all. And they've been sitting there being powerful and wealthy throughout this whole period of time. So 35,000 troops seems like a silly thing, a silly number of troops to invade the Persian Empire with, because the Persians are so much bigger. Okay, the king at the time is named Darius. This is not the Darius before. This is a great-great-grandson or something of that Darius. But Darius, of course, he looks at this 35,000 man force. He looks at Alexander at age 20, and he says, this kid doesn't have to know what he's bitten off, right? He's going, I'm going to teach this kid a lesson. And so he underestimates Alexander, and he sends a force of about 40,000 Persians to face off with Alexander at the river Granicus. Okay, now, Darius faces Alexander, and so Granicus is a pretty close battle. It's actually one of the closest battles that Alexander fought with the Persians. His cavalry was kind of pushed aside, but his dad's Felix was able to drive through and persevere that day and chase the Persians from the field. But it was pretty much an even battle, 40,000 to 35,000, especially for Alexander. Those are pretty good odds. And so he wins the Battle of Granicus. So now Darius takes him a little more seriously and faces him again at the Battle of Issus with a lot more troops, but Alexander, again, is victorious at Issus. Alexander's methods were, he knew that he was outnumbered, so he knew he couldn't just stand and for hours fight this larger army, but his strategy was always to get to the king and either kill the king or chase the king from the battlefield, because where the king goes, the army goes, right? And so it's kind of cutting the head off the snake strategy. We get to the top and we kill the leader, then the rest of the army will flee and we won't have to fight him. And that's what happens at Issus. Issus is on another river, right, a shallow river, and his forces storm into the river against the Persians, and they're fighting in the river. But as they're doing that, Alexander takes his cavalry around the edge and drives through the Persian archers into the back of the line where Darius is sitting in his chariot. Darius sees him coming and panics. I was like, who's stopping Alexander? He's so close to me. And Darius drives from the battlefield. And as soon as Darius flees, the rest of the Persian army runs. And so the battle really takes about 30 to 45 minutes. And Alexander's victorious. Okay, so there's Darius. He looks scared. That's history. Poor Darius, they remember him as a scared guy. So Darius III, there he is. Now, this is actually a Roman mosaic, and we'll look at this when we get to Rome. But again, the Romans emulated, loved Alexander, wanted to be like Alexander. Okay, so Battle of Issus, here we go. Alexander plans to win the battle by using fast-moving cavalry to strike Darius, and he drives through the Persian archery, or the archers who flee, and gets to Darius and chases her from the battlefield. Okay, good. And there we have the whole thing, the whole mural there of Darius here in his chariot and Alexander here. And there are two battles like this, so we're not really sure what battle this mosaic depicts, but it could be Issus. It could be the next battle that we'll talk about. Okay, so Alexander there on the side. Okay, so after Issus, now Alexander is free to explore the coastline of Palestine and the Middle East. So he drives south He conquers Israel. He drives into Egypt. He conquers Egypt. He names himself Pharaoh. He founds the most famous city of Alexandria. There'll be a few Alexandrias, and that's in Egypt. And he goes across the desert and finds mummies, and because it's all a matter of when you get to Egypt, you want to make sure it's all about prophecy and ancient, destiny. And so he felt he was the new Pharaoh. Now, Darius is absent during this period of time. Alexander has free reign to go and conquer city after city there in western Persia. But eventually, Darius is going to make a comeback. He's going to collect a massive army. Most reports say it was around 250,000 men against the 30,000 Alexander has. And he's going to meet Alexander at the Battle of Gaugamela, which is Alexander's greatest battle. Okay? So Alexander's army of 35,000, they defeat the Persians at 250,000, right? Darius flees again from the field, and the Persian Empire is defeated at that point. This was Darius' last shot to kill Alexander and drive the Greeks back to Greece. He fails, and therefore he flees and leaves his capital city open for invasion by the Greeks. So the city of Babylon is where they march to. Okay, so here's the battle, and here's what happens. The question you might be asking is, well, how could a force of 35,000 defeat a force of 250,000? Again, Alexander's strategy is to get to Darius and kill Darius. But Darius knows this. It happened at the Battle of Issus, so he's not going to fall for it this time. So he puts his huge army in front here, and he puts himself in the back, right? Back here. And the Greeks, Alexander, doesn't face his line directly on, but angles his Greek squares here, and then curves the end of his line like a hook to try to protect his flank. The rear phalanx is back here. This is a supply train. And the one thing about ancient warfare is you always want to keep your supplies close, but you always want to protect it from the enemy so they don't just get into your food and destroy everything, right? So he has a phalanx back here in the supply train. Now, here's his. So Darius is very sheltered behind his huge line. He's going to stay there, and he's going to wait till he doesn't believe Alexander can get to him. His cavalry is right over here. The cavalry in the map, as you'll see on the PowerPoint, is the diagonal lines. And so those are all horsemen. And the other lines are for the most part, are infantry. But anyway, so for Darius, the cavalry is there. Alexander, at the beginning of the battle, begins to drive here to the west, just pulling out this way, just riding his horses as fast as he can that way. Darius has no idea what's going on. Where's Alexander going? And he talks to his cavalry commander, and he says, Bessus, his cavalry commander, go see what Alexander's doing. So Bessus takes all his cavalry and drives out, just matching Alexander, just to see where he's going, right? Well, what Alexander has done is Alexander has put infantry right here on the edge, yes? So when Bessus gets all the way out here, the infantry jumps them, right, and keeps them busy, allowing Alexander to turn around and drive through a gap in the Persian line, behind the line, to get to Darius, right? So he makes a gap, and then he exploits the gap, right? And that's how he wins. He drives to Darius. Darius sees him coming in again. He's more shocked than ever that Alexander's been able to get through his massive soldiers. But here's the problem for Alexander. Darius' army is so big, they're pushing the Greeks back. And Greeks are being killed, and they're trying to hold their own, but there's just such a massive force here that Alexander barely is able to drive Darius from the field, and then immediately has to turn around and drive back to save his army, right? Because his army is about to get crushed by the Persians, and that was the strategy. The strategy was he had to get to Darius before his army collapsed, because it was only a matter of time before 250,000 men were going to overwhelm 30,000 men, right? And so he wants to chase Darius, but he can't because he's got to get back and save his army. Okay? So it doesn't matter anyway, because Darius doesn't go back to his city. He flees, and Alexander drives into the city of Babylon and becomes king of Persia right there, right? And so he meets Darius' family. He doesn't kill them. He accepts them and says, "You're royalty." He puts them up. And he's very kind. As a conqueror, he's very kind to the Persians. He respects the generals and their royalty and things like that. And since Darius was probably not a strong king anyway, as we've seen, they were more willing to accept Alexander as their leader because he was a dynamic personality and a conqueror and successful and all that stuff. And so there wasn't a lot of domestic strife in Persia now that Darius has gone and Alexander was in charge. But Alexander has to catch Darius, so he drives east and into what is today Afghanistan, into the mountains of Afghanistan, trying to find Darius. And he spends the next 3 years looking for him. He never finds Darius. Darius is eventually killed by his bodyguard. The bodyguard kills Darius and then presents the body to Alexander, thinking they're going to get a big reward. Alexander has them killed because, in the words of Alexander, you don't kill a king. Only a king can kill a king. And I don't really think that Alexander had any plans to kill Darius. Alexander, side note, had married Darius' daughter, and so he was wanting to be accepted as royal family, right? So, but Alexander continues to drive east. Even though Darius is gone, he really doesn't have an excuse anymore, except that he just wants to see what's over those mountains. So they go over the Hindu Kush mountains, and they arrive in India. Now, in India, he faces a massive army from an Indian kingdom that has like elephants, and they've never seen elephants before. And he faces off against this. This is his toughest battle. He almost loses this battle. He's wounded gravely in this battle. And but his Greek soldiers are able to drive the Indian king back. So now he is also controller of northern India. So he controls Greece, he controls Turkey, he controls the old Persian Empire, which is Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, and now he controls northern India, which remember we talked about was the Seleucid dynasty in India, right? So Alexander claims northern India as part of his empire, and the Greek army moves 200 miles into India. Okay? Now, who knows what Alexander was thinking? Who knows how far he would have gone, right? He was just pushing and pushing. We know that he was taught by Alexander and or Aristotle, and Aristotle, of course, told him about the world and how there's a great sea this way, and maybe Alexander was just trying to reach the sea and didn't know how far it was. But his army had traveled 11,000 miles in 11 years. This is one of the greatest fighting forces that the world had ever seen. They always won, they never lost, but they never got a chance to celebrate their victories because they were constantly on the move, they were constantly fighting. And so Alexander's goal is just to keep moving as far as you can until you reach the ocean. Alexander's troops are like, I don't think so. And so this is the point. You got to imagine how bad it was to be led by a general like Alexander and say, we're not going any further. It's not like you've been losing and morale is bad. You've won and your reputation precedes you, but you are spent. You're done. You can't go any further. And so his army refuses to march with him. And again, that kind of breaks Alexander's heart, but he decides to turn around and go back to Babylon. So back in Babylon, he makes plans to invade Europe. So he's going to go west this time. He's going to go past Greece and into Eastern Europe and maybe even into Italy. So that was his new plan, create a new army, that type of thing. But in the spring of 324, Alexander becomes seriously ill with a fever, and 11 days later he dies. Okay, so before he ever had a chance to invade Europe, he's dead. Probably, I think, a month before his 33rd birthday. So on his deathbed, of course, this is very sudden. Nobody thinks Alexander's going to die. There have been no plans as to what to do with his empire after his death. His generals are very nervous, sitting around the bed. What is the plans for your empire, Alexander? Tell us. And a few of his last words, according to the person writing stuff down, was when they asked Alexander, "Who will your empire go to?" And Alexander's response was, "The strongest." Yeah? And so after Alexander's death, that's what happens. The generals break off and form their own private armies and fight each other for control of the empire. Eventually, 3 major generals will control different areas of the empire. Now, back to Alexander's death for a second. He died. Maybe it was a fever. Some people speculate it was poison. But what you have to remember is at this point in his life, Alexander had been wounded by pretty much every weapon known to man at the time. He was a general who always led from the front, which you don't really see much after this. Most generals stay in the back and kind of move pieces around like a chessboard. But Alexander set the plan in motion before the battle and then fought in the front with his soldiers, right? And that means he was shot by arrows, he was stabbed with spears, he was stabbed by swords. He'd been poisoned before, and he'd gotten over that poison. After the Battle of the Dapsus River, everybody thought he was dead, and he had to struggle to the front of his tent to show everyone he was still alive. And so he's a 32-year-old man, but he probably has a 50-year-old body. Because he at that point, not just the physical wounds, but he was an alcoholic. And he wouldn't sleep, and he'd stay up all night. And so there are 1,000 different reasons why Alexander probably died at age 32, and maybe it was poison as well, right? But he was that kind of guy. He was a guy that was extremely driven. He never stopped. I bet he barely slept because he was just always thinking, always going, always moving, and extremely, extremely confident, right? When you talk about the great generals of history, Alexander is usually number one, and there are debates about, you mean Alexander's the best general who ever lived? Well, here is the argument, and it's a very simple argument. He never lost, right? He is so many and zero, right? Napoleon lost. Hannibal lost. All those great generals lose. Alexander did not. And his confidence was scary. It's almost as if he read a book about his life before he was born and then just lived it the way he read it, because he knew what was going to happen. In the Battle of Issus, they don't know where he is before the battle. They can't find him. And they look in his tent, and he's asleep. They have to wake him up to fight the battle. And he's about to face an army that's twice his size. And he's asleep. He doesn't really care. And so he was so confident and just knew that everything he did was going to work out. And it mostly did. It mostly did. So it's scary. Okay, so let's get back to now Alexander's dead, and the empire is divided into three. Okay? Oh, come on now. That's Alexander's empire when it's snowy. I'm not sure what happened to that map. But remember, Alexander's empire, look it up, it's Turkey, it's Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. It also includes Egypt and the Middle East. It includes all the way to India. So it's a massive, massive empire, the biggest the world had ever seen at the time. In the West, some of the Chinese empires may be a little larger, but it was comparable to that size, right? Okay, so one of the results of the conquest of Alexander was the spread of the Greek culture throughout the world, the Hellenistic world. Again, this is how it happens, right? We study Hellenism. This is how Hellenism begins. Hellenistic is a term that means like the Greeks. It was used to describe other societies who adopted Greek culture, Greek philosophy, religion, science, art, technology that spread throughout the known world. That effects can still be seen today, which was what we wrote in class, right? How does the Greeks affect us today? We are practicing Hellenism when we talk about that, right? And Alexander was a big part of that. Okay, there we go. Oh, we're back to the beginning. Okay, so we're going through the slides. Great. So just to wrap up, Alexander, right, conquered most of the known world at the time, and was held as a hero, a god, by many in Western society. Namely, and this is a segue to our next chapter, the Romans. The Romans felt like Alexander was who they wanted to be. Because Alexander, like the Greeks of the Bronze Age, the Greeks of the Classical Age looked at the Greeks of the Bronze Age as heroes. The Romans looked at Alexander as a hero. Many of the sculptures we have of Alexander aren't Greek sculptures at all. They're Roman sculptures, right? And there's the famous story of Julius Caesar when he is 40 years old or something, and he comes across a bust of Alexander in some Roman town. He weeps because Alexander conquered the world at age 30, and he's 40 years old, and what has he done? Right? And so the greatest Hellenistic culture of the world was the Romans. And the Romans were never conquered by Alexander. But they looked at Alexander as if he were the conqueror they wanted to be. Right? This is who they wanted to be like him. And that's his legacy. In the West or in the East, in the places he conquered, there's a mixed bag. You go to Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan today, and there's some historians. Most of them think he's a villain because he came through their areas and he burned down their cities and he killed their people and he was an invader. He's a conqueror, right? So in the East, he's not as much of a hero. But in the West, in Europe, he's considered to be one of the greatest conquerors of all time, one of the greatest kings of all time. And the fact that his star shone so bright and then fell so quickly really gives him that romantic flair that people look at Alexander as, oh, what a tragic figure, but a successful and glorious figure as well. So that's Alexander. That sets us up to get to Rome. We're going to talk about the influence of Alexander and the Greeks on the Roman world next time in class. So if you have any questions, come see me in Coach class, and I'll see you later.